Well, joining me in the studio is Dalal Mawad, a seasoned Lebanese journalist. Great to have you with us, Dalal. Author of All She Lost, which chronicles the collapse of the Lebanese port explosion, the Beirut explosion, and the stories of women who lived through it. And one which I think there are still so many unanswered questions. There are, particularly over who's responsible, whether Hezbollah officials implicated, allegedly blocking the investigation. Let's start the fact that this is personal to you. You still have family in Lebanon. Just tell me about what the last 48 hours have been like for you.
I think it's been devastating watching Lebanon from afar, just like a lot of expats, Lebanese in France and across the world, feeling helpless and seeing history repeat itself, unfortunately. History repeating itself once again with these endless cycles of violence. And I think many of us, want this to stop immediately because we know how devastating this is going to be for Lebanon, who's reeling already under, a myriad of crises, including the economic crisis, has not recovered from the Beirut explosion, which you have mentioned. And there's a sense of longing, I would say. A lot of us want to be there despite the circumstances, because being here, as I said, we feel very helpless. I still have my family. My parents are there. My husband still lives in Lebanon. And so, we just want this to stop immediately. And I hope that diplomacy is the way out at this point. I don't see another way out, unfortunately.
We can see behind you while we're talking just the scale of people suddenly on the streets, suddenly homeless because they've been displaced from the south, or simply cannot get anywhere to rent in the city because all the apartments are taken up. The amount of people suddenly there, the vacuum, and also we have a situation with hospitals being full. I want your take on just, you've looked at Hezbollah, and I'm just interested to know there'll be a lot of people who support Hezbollah in Lebanon mourning the fact that Hassan Nasrallah has died. Your time looking at Hezbollah, clearly there are people that won't as well. And I just wonder what you think about the political vacuum that he's created now and what remains of Hezbollah, with your insight into what could happen next.
Yeah, a lot of questions. But I think, Nasrallah was, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, was the most powerful man in Lebanon. Although he wasn't in public office, he didn't hold like a position in the state. I think his assassination is going to be a turning point, not just for Lebanon, but the whole region, and for the so-called axis of resistance with Iran at its helm. It's clear that Hezbollah has been weakened in the past week with all these blows and hits, and now with Nasrallah killed, but also 7 top commanders of Hezbollah have been also assassinated by Israel, and the airstrikes are still ongoing. I think what we have to watch is what Iran's reaction is going to be. I personally believe Iran wants to preserve itself and is not going to strike back, at least cannot go into a full-blown war, a regional war. But I don't know. To be honest, the speeches that we've heard or the statements do not indicate an imminent retaliation, but we don't know. Iran has this style of, taking the time to retaliate, and has used proxies throughout histories to push back or fight back. When it comes to Hezbollah, I think, it's true that Nasrallah is probably the most loved politician, but also the most hated politician in Lebanon.
And worth saying, a politician that if you walk around the south of Beirut, and probably in the south, you see his poster on billboards everywhere.
But he's more than a politician. He's a political leader, he's a military commander, but he's also a religious and cultural icon, if you want. And for many, he's come to represent, became a symbol of resistance. He was behind the liberation of the south of Lebanon in 2000. He's seen by a lot of Lebanese, but also Arabs, as someone who brought back dignity to the Arabs. At the same time, his legacy is stained by the involvement of Hezbollah in Syria's civil conflict, fighting with Assad and crushing the opposition. Also, his legacy is, he's believed to be behind a series of political assassinations in Lebanon, also putting together a counter-revolution in 2019 when people went to the streets calling the political establishment, to leave and calling for reform. So it's a very complicated relationship that the Lebanese have with Nasrallah. And there's a sense of, I think, defeat and anger in some way, which I've seen in the past 24 hours among supporters of Nasrallah and others, because it's Israel that assassinated him. So the attacks on Lebanon have been widely seen as an attack on Lebanon's sovereignty, not just attacks on Hezbollah per se. And he's hard to replace, to be honest. There's a name put on the table. I think the party has been organizing itself and preparing for this scenario. But it's going to be very hard to fill his shoes because he filled so many roles. I mean, many people compare him to Nasser, who was, the former late Egyptian president.
Yeah. Who talked about Pan-Arabism.
Yes.
More specifically, Shiite sort of internationalism.
I mean, Nasrallah came to represent this Shiite axis of resistance with the proxies in Iraq and Yemen as well. But Hezbollah was the jewel of Iran, let's be honest. And today, I think the axis of resistance is in a deep crisis after all these hits that it's taken.
So you talk about a possible obvious successor. We're talking about Hisham Safieddine.
Exactly,
somebody
the cousin of Nasrallah.
A cousin of Nasrallah, somebody who's also very connected to Iran. I believe his son is married to the daughter of
Soleimani,
who was killed, the
and
general from the
he's known
IOG.
to be less pragmatic than Nasrallah. And
he
even
looks like him? He sounds like him?
He looks like him, even, ruthless. They say that, Nasrallah was more pragmatic than him. There are also a lot of question marks as to how much experience Safieddine has. Hezbollah is really weakened today, and there's been a huge breach, an intelligence breach, and it's believed that it comes from within the organization. Before this is, an Israeli security breach, there's a need to look inside. And let's not belittle the economic crisis with this security breach. I think the economic crisis that started in 2019 played a role, in turning some people within the community against Hezbollah.
This is a very good point. This has been mentioned by a number of analysts. The idea that poor Lebanese in the south, the attraction of being what many those who support Hezbollah would say is a traitor to them, but actually the intelligence to Israel and the money paid could be a big factor.
Hezbollah provided a lot of social services. It was a state within the state.
Which brings me on to go back to 48 hours ago, this explosion in Dahir. You were there in the summer. Let me bring up this article you did. This is Newsline magazine. You talk about Hezbollah fighters' stories. I think we can see it here. If we can show it in the gallery, this is the piece that Dalal did. Fighter stories as told by their mothers. I think the gallery can bring it up. Here we go. So this is Newsline. Basically, you were in Dahir over the summer. You got permission from Hezbollah to have these conversations and a very deeper insight, rather than a two-dimensional terrorist story of who fights for Hezbollah and why.
I think it's important to humanize these fighters, regardless of where you stand, if you consider them terrorists or not. They're human beings at the end. And I think it was interesting to go back to their early life, their childhood, their teenage years before they were killed. And I thought mothers are the most powerful storytellers. This is what I've witnessed throughout my career as a journalist, women and mothers specifically. And it's the angle I took in my book. But so the mothers were there talking about their children who were killed. They call them martyrs. Martyrdom is an intrinsic part of Shia identity and Hezbollah's identity. And these kids, these boys are indoctrinated very early on. They join what is known as Al-Mahdi Scouts, Hezbollah's scouts. And they go on...
This is like 3 years old at these Al-Mahdi
camps. As early as 3, exactly. And the indoctrination starts there. There's a lot of religious teaching. So this is what I've noticed, is that the religion doctrine is very, very strong. And it's stronger than the political identity. And it's actually what pushes these people to fight, because in Shi'ism, in their history, there were two imams, Imam Ali and Imam Hussein, who were assassinated and considered as martyrs, and they've come to represent for this community the ultimate sacrifice for social justice. And so these these people really believe that it's a religious duty to be killed for a greater cause, in this case, fighting against Israel. And a lot of these mothers, despite their pain, they're very convinced. And the doctrine is in the family, to a lesser extent, but some of these children end up in military training and end up enrolling with Hezbollah as early as 13 and 14, and they go fighting as teenagers, as underage kids, and it's just the majority of the Shia community believes in these ideals and in their duty to serve and to fight. And there's something very interesting that Imam told me, that it's not martyrdom that's the objective, it's the victory against Israel or whatever cause they're fighting for. And it's very religious for them. They see their martyrs almost as saints who did something good.
Briefly, because I think actually where you lead us next gives us an idea of where this can go in terms of dismantling an organisation and to what extent. You talked about the social fabric, but I think part of your piece you talked about widows, mothers, those that have lost those fighting for Hezbollah get a financial package each month. And that tells you about the fabric of society in a very poor country right now and how important this militia, politically and militarily, is.
Yeah, Hezbollah, but also other political parties in Lebanon have weakened the state, and they come in and they fill the shoes of the state, and Hezbollah is no exception. It's a state within a state and a community on its own. It provides the fighters a salary, but also once they are killed, their families have an income for their, a lifetime income, and they're provided free medical and educational services as well. They go to school for free. They are in hospitals, getting treated for free, and they feel like the party is taking care of them. Of course, the question is if that income stops one day, and we've seen this with the financial crisis, that I think, the means were, with the sanctions on Iran as well, Hezbollah didn't have the means it had and had to create, this criminal network around the world to finance its activities. If one day, not just Hezbollah is, weakened militarily, that financially also, if it cannot fulfill this role, would it push people, to support the party less or not? But again, there's a very, very strong doctrine, and it's very religious as well.
Dalal, great to have you in the studio. Great to talk to you. Dalal Mawad, an author of All She Lost, Lebanese journalist based here in Paris.